Okay, so our presenter this morning is Reverend Joseph T. Farkas. Humanist chaplains provide spiritual care from both humanist and ethical culture perspectives. Reverend Joseph T. Farkas will share stories from his experience as a humanist atheist chaplain, playing in a traditionally theistic role in moments of intense human experiences. What Am I Doing Here? Explores these moments of connection and disconnection, meaningfulness and meaninglessness, love and empathy of his professional journey. Farkas, who holds a Master of Divinity, has served as a humanist chaplain and celebrant through the Humanist Society for more than 10 years. He is also currently an ethical culture leader in training. When he isn't learning how to be an ethical culture leader or working at one of several Chicagoland hospitals, Joseph enjoys working out and spending time with his wife and their dog. And this time, please welcome Joseph Farkas.
Thank you so much to our host. How are the audio levels?
Good.
Wonderful. My name is Joseph Farkas. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I have been a humanist chaplain through the Humanist Society for over 10 years, as my gracious host related. I have such wonderful handouts from your ethical society here. So I've titled this talk, What Am I Doing Here? Because it's a question that has haunted me through my professional career. And we'll get into that after a brief story, which is that journey to be a humanist chaplain takes one of its most dramatic steps in the final years of my college career, when a fraternity brother of mine, who was a Marine and a veteran of the wars in Iraq, came to me struggling with PTSD. He opened up to me because his medications and his treatments were becoming burdensome on his spirit and his psyche. He shared that during his time overseas, while he was the squad leader of his team, one of the Marines under his command had been killed. They had been together through fights for months and months on end, taking turns at the role of the team. And it happened to be during his term as the fire team leader that his brother in arms had fallen. And this happens often, and it's an incredibly sad and devastating loss. And especially for my friend, he had not just failed in his vision of the tactical situation, but he had failed his friend as a brother in arms. He had failed the Marine Corps as a steward of the Marines under him. He had failed the Marines' family. He had failed his parents, who raised him to be better. And in his deep spirit, a part of him felt as though he had failed God. It haunted him, it followed him home. And this feeling of failure didn't go away with his medications or with attendance through other kinds of care. So he came to me and he said, Joe, I know you don't believe in God, but I know that you study the Bible and religion a lot. What do you think? And that trust he put in me is based on a sense that regardless of what his religion was, and regardless of what my religion was, that I had nothing but completely unqualified, benevolent feelings towards him. That I saw him, and I respected him and his beliefs, and that by working together, listening and bearing witness to him, maybe he could find a way to rediscover worth and success in his life, even though he'd been through this awful experience of losing his brother in arms. He was able to finish his nursing degree, the classic Christian model of the centurion turned healer. But I was asked by Jill to visit and share some of this journey. This is a long trip from where I began to there and then to here. Now, I'm not a stranger to the question. I can't escape it, as I mentioned. Chaplain interviews always begin with it. Describe your personal spiritual development across your entire life. Please be specific. It's not unusual to see 5-page answers for that. But what they're really checking for is just a few red flags. Are you a discrimination disaster waiting to happen? Are you here to evangelize to patients who can't escape from your company? How do you respond to being questioned about your religion? Do you flip out? But what are chaplains supposed to do? And I ask that because many of the congregations I speak with haven't seen a chaplain in maybe 40 years. Some people have avoided them religiously anytime they enter into a hospital or any environment where they might encounter a chaplain. I've heard the analogy of spam. Some people really like spam, and some people have never tried it and have suspicions about it. But if you offer it to a group, certainly somebody in the back raises their hands and say, ooh, me. I would like some spam. People who grew up with it, people who are familiar with it, people for whom it's a comfort food. My friend from the Marines saw his chaplain every single day, and although they didn't share exactly the same denomination, I've met many soldiers, including those who are not religious, who made a point to visit their chaplain frequently. But it depends. Chaplains are supposed to do multitudes. Some of my duties are pretty mundane. I keep track of Sunday communion lists for those who want communion in the hospital. I might deliver battery-powered Shabbos candles for my Jewish patients on Fridays. No open flames in the hospital, please. Remembering what hospital TV channel Catholic services are on Sundays so that our Catholic patients can check in with the cardinal. I might point out what direction Mecca is in a particular hospital room. Deep inside a hospital, a lot of compasses don't function well, so it's important to remain oriented for those of our patients who pray in a particular direction. I might stock meditation cushions for our Buddhist patients, or prayer rugs, again for our Muslim patients. Other times it's emotional support for those who are anxious, lonely, isolated from their loved ones, isolated from any of the relationships that give people life and that they lose touch with when they're in long-term hospital stays. I might just sit quietly and actively listen to them, talking through what's going on. Active listening is simply having a conversation, but without ordering, warning, giving advice, persuading with logic, moralizing, judging, praising, shaming, analyzing, minimizing, probing, or distracting. You might ask, what do I say if I can't do any of that? And the answer is you shut up, you listen. It's humanizing to be heard and seen, and to be treated as though what you're experiencing is worth being heard and worth being understood. And that's something that can get lost in feeling like a lab rat in a hospital, constantly being bothered for another blood draw, another stick, another pill. This non-anxious, non-judgmental presence is the only care that truly anybody can provide. But chaplains practice to be experts at it. It becomes important to learn how to resist our natural instincts to do those things, to offer answers, to attempt to comfort, to try to say something that will help people feel better when things happen like children passing away. And to just sit there with someone and accompany them through the worst day of their lives. A day that maybe they will relive over and over and over again. A great teacher of mine, a seeker who went through several religions himself, born in Thailand to a Jewish family, converted to Catholicism, and then finally to Buddhism, described it as sitting in the bonfire of someone's life. It's incredibly uncomfortable, but they cannot leave. You may notice sometimes that the nurse or doctor steps in, they keep their questions short and brief, they don't pry, they don't poke, because it's painful. It's painful as human beings who empathize with each other naturally when we witness somebody losing and suffering terribly, to feel pain. And for many people, it's so unbelievable they can't even remain in the room. But as chaplains, we make a point to show that even if you don't have anything to say, after all, what could you possibly say to accomplish anything? Just staying there and listening and not abandoning them is an incredible gift that we hear about years later from our patients. That, oh, it was the worst day, but I remember everything you did for me. You were so wonderful, and I'm so grateful that you were there for me. We might look back and say, I don't recall doing anything, not even fetching a blanket or offering or getting a glass of water. Some people are not in the mood to be touched by it, to have a blanket thrown about their shoulders. They're not in the mood to drink water. Sometimes we may just sit with them and listen to them talk. We may not say anything. They may not learn our names or learn our religion. But that's fine. It's maintaining that connection with a life worth living, like my friend coming back from Iraq, rediscovering reasons why his life continued to be worth living, even as he had felt like he had failed the Marine Corps that was so important, failed his relationship with God. You start with those small things, and you build up that trust that maybe there is something somewhere where we can continue to find hope and find worth, even in circumstances where we can't see something on the other side. But whether you're a humanist or an ethical culturalist or a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, offering answers, where we said don't provide answers, don't lecture, don't do anything like that. Lectures about the value of one's life are entirely unwelcome when one's life feels as though it's never going to get better. So sometimes we just sit. Sometimes we just listen. Sometimes we just stay when everything else is going away. But what am I doing here? Before I was someone who my friend could seek out for that religious counsel, that spiritual counsel. I grew up in a home with different religious backgrounds, like many of you. My mother was Catholic. My father was much more of an existential European Enlightenment philosopher fanboy. In those days, if you wanted to marry a nice Catholic girl and you weren't Catholic, they couldn't make you convert to Catholicism, but you had to raise the kids Catholic. That was not negotiable. My father was very confident that in the end he would win out, and he did. Neither my brother or I are practicing Catholics. And over time, my family, as a young Catholic family in the 90s and moving into 2000s, we saw a lot of changes in the church. And I just did an interview with a group that does interviews of formerly religious people about why they changed their faith. And you know, I know that everyone always hears about the logical arguments, the many, many logical arguments for why one might change their faith. But what it came down to for me, I think, and what I told them, was that ultimately there was an ask that I was being asked as part of my Catholic faith, to trust that the Bible was true, that there was a God, and that was resting on the moral authority of the institution. And by the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, that moral authority was pretty threadbare and eventually gave way. But I'll always remember and I'll always appreciate what the Catholic Church taught me about space, about sound, about smell, about music, about ritual. All of those aesthetic lessons the church gave me. My professor in college instilled us with an idea called episteme's discourses and discursive formations. He had this feeling that there were these experiences that people have that form specific ideas about our culture and then become institutions, like a Catholic church, like a fraternity that I joined while I was in college. And so as I was leaving the church, I came into an intentional moral community. Some of you may have never experienced fraternity life as an intentional, moral, ritual community or a sorority. And that's fine, not all of them are the same. But it was a new idea for me. It was an idea that, you might be familiar with this idea, that people of a like moral and ethical framework can organize a community that accomplishes their goals and empowers them to do the things they believe about the world. Does that sound familiar to any of you? So I was really fascinated by this idea because I had just lost the church, and I was coming to this idea that actually anybody can put those things together. Anybody can decide to form a community. Anybody can decide to set the moral parameters of it and build a family, a found family. So I went from studying history, just getting more into comparative religion, Joseph Campbell, Alan Watts, people like that. I studied ancient religion, I studied modern religion, I studied Eastern religion and Central Asian religion in college. And it was that familial relationship in a values-based community and my experiences studying world religions and ancient religions that led my friend, the Marine, to ask me to help him in a very practical, modern way how I could help him rediscover and maintain his sense of hope and meaning in his life. And something clicked, that this was something somebody can do. The problem was, at the time, I'm an atheist, and there can't be atheist chaplains. That's not a thing. But this was 2010 also, and I'll come back to that 2010 point. I discovered an intense belief that maybe chaplaincy was what was for me, for my life. What I wanted to do, it was a calling. We have a word for it in chaplaincy. It's a calling story. But I wasn't a Christian anymore, so I didn't know if calling was the right word. I'd studied Buddhism. Buddhism has a word for calling. They call it bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is this awakening flare in your mind and your spirit that says, I must become a bodhisattva and devote my life to assisting people in reaching nirvana. That is my calling in this life. I said, well, then I guess I must be a Buddhist then. So I called my religious professor. I should say I emailed him. I didn't have his phone number. But I emailed him. I said, I've had an experience with bodhicitta and I wish to become a chaplain. Where do I go next? And I'm sure this was a pretty intense email for him to get. But he was an affable religious professor who I'm sure had gotten a couple of wild emails from his students in his career. And he kind of said, well, I guess you need to find a teacher in a seminary. It's like, too easy. There are 3 seminaries in this country, 4 if you count a conglomerate of universities in Southern California, where you can get an M.Div. I use the honorific reverend because I've completed a Master of Divinity. It just kind of lubricates my professional relationships with other chaplains, but don't feel compelled to use it here. You can go to Harvard, which I was not going to get into. You can go to Naropa in Colorado, which I could not afford to get into. And there's a tiny little school in Rosemead, California, which used to be the Christian psychologist movement's resort campus, their little retreat campus. Anybody here remember the Christian psychological movement in the 60s and 70s? Christian psychology? No, nobody? That's fine. When they went defunct, they sold their retreat center in Rosemead, California to Shilai Temple, the local Buddhist temple, which is an extension of Fugoshan Temple in Taiwan, a big holdout for humanistic Buddhism in Taiwan. It's a perfect place. It's no wonder they sold it for so cheap. The University of the West is built at practically a 30-degree angle right on top of the San Gabriel Fault. I don't think there's a single flat walkway on the entire campus. And they probably picked it up dirt cheap. I don't think any of the buildings were new. But it was a great place to learn about impermanence. It was really a wonderful time. I transitioned from a small Midwestern town, Akron, Ohio, to Los Angeles, But I had this bubble. I had this wonderful bubble surrounded by monks of every tradition. I had Chinese Chan monks in gray robes. I had Vietnamese nuns, also gray robes. I had Sri Lankan monks in bright orange robes, saffron robes, and red robes, Tibetan monks. All working together and learning about this application of non-theistic principles to chaplaincy. And it was great for a time, but as my seeker teacher once said, people think that your religion is a plate of garbage, so you decide, I'm going to get another plate. This is garbage. And you discover this next religion is just another plate of garbage. And you keep looking for new religions over and over and over again, and it's just, this is a plate of garbage. And he says, you have to find the plate of garbage you can eat. Very well. But much like Catholicism, when I really submitted what I was learning about Buddhism to the inquiry that I subjected Catholicism to, I discovered another maxim, which is that seminaries are atheist factories. Most people's Sunday school, familial, local religious education does not survive encountering a master's level education or a professional seminary level education about their faith. So a lot of people who go to seminary end up leaving their faith, and it goes for Buddhists too. Because after 2 years or so of studying Buddhism, I had really discovered that many of the most advanced, most legendary practitioners of Buddhism had their own criticisms of Buddhism about whether it even worked or not. There's the old story of the Chan master who was called by the Emperor of China, and he enters the throne room. He comes to the Emperor, and the Emperor says, I've built hundreds of temples all over China to spread the Buddha's teaching. I must be a great Buddhist. The Zen master says, building temples does not make you a great Buddhist. And the Emperor says, but I meditate 6 hours a day, every day, even around all of my imperial duties. And the Buddhist master says, meditating does not make you a great Buddhist. And he says, but I've delivered scribes from India and from Tibet to translate Buddhist sutras so that the people can read the holy words of the Buddha. And he says, translating sutras and reading them does not make you a great Buddhist. And the Emperor says, if training monks and building temples and reading sutras and meditating can't make me a great Buddhist, why even practice Buddhism? And the Zen master says, I don't know. It seemed like some of the greatest thinkers of Buddhism had come to the conclusion that the process of everyone reaching enlightenment was quite independent of anybody trying or doing anything about it, and would be just fine if none of us practiced it at all. Okay. But there were other issues that I took with Buddhist Buddhology. Right? I say Buddhology rather than theology because we believe in the Buddha, not in God. I think one that sticks out is the notion of collective karma. Is what if we believe that karma is real and that people suffer today because of things that they've done in the past, then does that mean that people's suffering are justified? And how do we approach communities that are being unjustly and terribly treated in this life, ethically and Buddhologically, if it's their karma to be suffering this way? And it just didn't agree with me. The notion that the reason why people of color in the country are suffering so terribly is because of karma from a past life, that women are treated so unfortunately in the country and in the world as a result of karma from a past life. I just thought this was morally repugnant to me, morally and intellectually repugnant to me, as morally and intellectually repugnant as anything, well, almost anything I had ever heard in my previous religion. And so I kind of fell out a little bit with Buddhism, and that's when humanism snatched me up. I matriculated in 2012. The Humanist Society only started endorsing chaplains in 2011, so I had not even stumbled into them yet, but they were on me fast. And luckily, my teacher, who was a seeker again, was very supportive. We had Christians in the program, and now I was the first humanist in the program. And because my desire to be a chaplain led through the military, it became clear through my education that I needed to become an enlisted soldier if I wanted to ever become a military chaplain, because there's no such thing as humanist chaplains in the military yet. And all of the previous humanist chaplains had failed to break that stained glass ceiling, because none of them had been veterans before. And all of the first chaplains of new denominations, the first Hindu chaplain, the first Muslim chaplain, the first Buddhist chaplain, all of them had been veterans. So if I was going to break that stained glass ceiling, I needed to be a veteran too. So I enlisted to be a combat medic in the National Guard. And that's where I began to start seeing more and more the reason why what I was doing was so dramatic and different. My copy of Demon Haunted World, which I brought with me to basic training, was taken from me because it was not a religious text. Luckily, through the ministry of the military atheists and freethinkers, it was returned to me by the brigade chaplain with an apology. 2 soldiers who saw the Humanist manifesto on the inside of my locker. You're allowed to post your religious tracts on the inside of your locker. It's one of the only things you're allowed to post up are your religious materials. Said, that looks an awful lot like what I do and what I believe. Where can I learn more? I said, ask the chaplain. The chaplain told them they were angry at God and threw them out. This is their chaplain. That was my first taste of that. I can recall speaking to a sergeant. We as combat medics are sometimes taught that we're the first line of defense for mental health. And I asked the training NCO, I said, where are the chaplains in the fight for mental health in the Army and the suicide crisis? And he said, effing absent. I said, what can they do to change that? He said, they can get their heads out of their asses. It's like, well. Leave it up to the sergeants to say it how it is. I got back to my Tilted campus, I finished my degree, and I was very fortunate to fall into a residency at the Department of Veteran Affairs. And it was almost immediately that someone there recognized what it was I was doing there. A senior chaplain, too senior and too established in his role to bother with things like staff meetings, who preferred to show up to work, quietly go to the hospice wing of the hospital, and occupy the rest of his day there without not being bothered by anybody else, came to me, clapped me on the shoulder, he said, Joe, I think it's really great and important what you're doing. So many people need someone just like you to be there for them. And when you break these boundaries and you do things for them, I think a lot of people are going to come forward and talk about how much they agree with it. And I thought, that's a really weird thing to say to me, Dale. Are you a secret humanist chaplain? I don't know. If you've never heard of the Clergy Project is a nationwide organization that provides support to secret apostates who are trapped in their religious roles but can't admit to being atheists, or their communities will lose their leadership. So it's a big thing. And I've even heard CFI. I was at a CFI meeting where they said, I think the next big crisis of the priesthood will be how many of them are secretly atheists. And remember, seminaries are secret atheist factories. But Dale recognized immediately that humanism offered something unique to chaplaincy. That as humanists and as ethical culturists, we believe in the individual worth and value of every single human being without qualification. And that's one of the essential qualities of being a good chaplain. Because if you recognize that every single human being has dignity and worth, every single human being has value, then you can have empathy for them. Even people who have made terrible mistakes, done terrible things. And that's what he recognized that I and my humanist chaplain peers were bringing to the profession of chaplaincy. And so I was sent on one of my first great humanist encounters to a gentleman who was in our psych ward. He had been a target packet builder. He performed the intelligence analysis and organization to decide where the door kickers went. And if he did his job right, the bad guys get caught and the whole area becomes safe. And he does his job wrong, either the bad guys get away or they get attacked. He might send them into an ambush. Or sometimes the bad guy doesn't get caught and they get attacked. He dealt with a lot of stress from his job because as an enlisted soldier, his officers and his commanders didn't often respect his opinion. an opinion which he felt was always informed by the evidence and the packets that he provided them. He saw friends injured and killed because his intelligence was not believed, wasn't trusted. People did whatever they wanted, regardless of what he told them. When he sat down with me and another chaplain, he said, I think it's really great that you two are here to talk to me, but I'm not really religious, so we just put that out there. And I said, that's fine. I'm not religious either. I don't believe in God. I'm a humanist chaplain. And he smiled. He couldn't quite wrap his head around it right away, but the more he got his head around it, the better he felt. He said, oh, I've never encountered one of those. I said, well, you're talking to the only one in the VA, so make it good. But there were other people at the VA who did not understand what I was doing. On my last day at the VA, I was called into my supervisor's office. And he asked me, he said, I gotta ask, what are you doing here? If you didn't believe in God, if you don't believe in heaven or hell or any of that stuff, why not be a social worker? Why not be a psychiatrist or a psychologist? Never mind, this was an extraordinarily discriminatory conversation to be having. Why don't you just not have your religion? Like, at a federal institution? But I was determined to escape from this residency intact. And I had done a lot of standing still and shutting my mouth in basic training. And I said, all right, just keep your mouth shut, Joe. Just let him talk. Let it get out. Just be a chaplain. Be a chaplain for your chaplain boss. And you'll survive this. And I got out of there alive. And it wasn't the first time. I had an encounter with a professional chaplain. We had a family who was losing a small child, and they had asked no chaplain's visit. They had no faith tradition listed. Now, it's common practice, if you have a family in a situation, and you notice on their faith denomination that they have a particular faith, a Jewish patient, a Muslim patient, a Buddhist patient. It's perfectly normal to ask a family that is not asked to speak to a chaplain on staff if they would like a chaplain of their denomination. Because, like I'm sure many people in the room here, many assume that all chaplains are Christians, and most chaplains are. And a lot of people have had deep religious trauma from being evangelized to and spoken down to and mistreated in an already delicate place like a hospital by a chaplain who doesn't have their best interests at heart. So I remarked that, should we ask this family if they would like an atheist chaplain? I was told, in no uncertain terms, that I know you don't believe in God and all. Again. But they didn't need to ask this family what their religion was, and they weren't going to offer an atheist chaplain to this nun family who was losing their child, and I was not to ask any further questions, and I was not to offer. Well. Again, stand still, shut your mouth, go back to basic training, just get out of that encounter before you say something that gets you fired. I ran that one up the flagpole to my supervisor. I'll let you know if the chaplain's ever talked to about that encounter. I can't imagine a chaplain from the Ethical Society or a chaplain from the Humanist Society telling a Catholic chaplain, I know you believe in Jesus and all, but I know you... It was a nice career while it lasted. And even then, in the National Guard, I continued to experience unusual encounters like that. A chaplain found out that I was hoping to be a military chaplain one day. He called me aside. He said, let's talk about chaplaincy. I met him in his little bivouac, his little tent setup, one sweltering AT. And he says, what do you think religion is for, Joe? And I said, I think it's for helping people. And he kind of had a sensible chuckle to himself. And he said, no. The real point of religion is recruitment. And I thought, and chaplaincy always exists in tension with evangelism. Now, I was taught very carefully that evangelism is absolutely a no-go for chaplaincy. But again, I came back to that one. I was so thankful and so grateful for all of those push-ups and all of those long hours standing at attention with my mouth shut. It made me an incredible listener to stuff like this. I just stood still, blinked and breathed, and got out of there alive with my career intact. This is the kind of chaplain many soldiers deal with, and it was the kind of chaplain that I had soldiers in my basic training group deal with, who told humanist soldiers that they were just mad at God, that they weren't going to talk to them about atheism, they weren't going to talk to them about humanism, they weren't going to even breathe a word about ethical culture, much less. But nevertheless, the people I encountered continue to make it worthwhile. I had a cancer patient I came to visit, sitting in his bed. I said, I'm the chaplain. And I do try to keep a certain image of chaplaincy about me. Normally I wear a cardigan. I wore this one here. I brought this one here today just to show you. The cardigan is the unofficial uniform of the soft caregivers. If you're at the hospital and a woman comes into the room who's not in scrubs and is wearing a cardigan, what's the assumption? Social worker, child life specialist, psychologist, therapist. What are the soft caregivers? A man comes into the room with a cardigan. What does this guy do? Could be a TV show. Anybody here remember Fred Rogers? Guy plus cardigan equals chaplain. I have never been mistaken for a social worker wearing a cardigan this long. This one doesn't have any sleeves because I didn't want to die in this heat. And it kind of looks like a stole from the front, if I gather it. If I gather it's kind of stole-like, which is nice if I have to do a baptism or restraining, it looks kind of official. It's my humanist aesthetic. Sometimes I'll button my collar, which is unusual. I'm never supposed to do that. But I don't wear a collar stole, because I'm an atheist. There's no collar, no God, no collar. So it's still buttoned at the top. It still looks very professional and neat. It still looks very chaplain-y. But there's no marks, no signs, no crosses, no stars, no moons, nothing, and no collar. It communicates all of that. But I came in and he said, thank you for coming in, this cancer patient, he said. But I'm not really religious. I said, that's fine, I'm a humanist chaplain. I don't have a belief in God either. And unlike my colleague, my brother in arms at the VA, who smiled as he gradually came to the realization that I was there witnessing him, bearing witness to where he was at, this patient started to cry. Because I understood that this was the only life that he was going to get. Just like he did. And I wasn't going to talk to him about heaven. And I wasn't going to offer to pray for him. And I wasn't going to talk about a plan. I was going to sit with him and I was to talk with him about what he and his wife wanted to do with the days that they had left. And about how he was going to go on a few more walks with his dogs. Whether they would go visit the kids or whether they would call the kids back to Chicagoland when things got really bad. Laying in his hospital bed, weak and ill, he and his wife were much more worried about the older dog, who was starting to slow down. Always mind and heart somewhere else than our own bodies, as it goes. We weren't talking about an afterlife. We weren't talking about what comes next. We were talking about what comes now. Being together in that moment. I will always know deep, deep, deep in the well of my heart that humanist chaplains like myself, humanist chaplains like Dr. Gomez-Brake, who's just awarded the best campus chaplain in the country, humanist chaplain at USC, that ethical culture and humanism through chaplaincy offer something special and unique that speaks to the heart of the work, the reality and the presence and the immediacy and the dignity of every single human being who suffers in the world. whether it's in the military or in the hospital. Even through mundane things, just being separated from your family or pets in a long hospital stay, or facing a life-altering injury or loss, a young child, or a disability. That's what I'm doing here. People ask me that question, what am I doing here? Is I'm being with people. But that brings me to today, the journey to ethical culture. That as we gather outside of the hospital setting, as we don't wait until people are hurting in hospitals or breaking down in the military, that we join people in their home life, in their day-to-day life, in their weekly life. Try to bring that education of active listening, edification, value of the individual. You start building that and spreading that in our day-to-day. We don't have to wait until it's a crisis. And it's been great to be here, a new home in ethical culture, that back in 2010 when I began my chaplaincy journey, I never knew it would be here. I never know I would be here doing this. But to be here doing this and seeing the spread of chaplaincy, humanist chaplaincy, and even chaplaincy with an ethical culture. I think Greg Bonan's also an endorsed chaplain. So it's beginning to spread. But that's what I'm doing here. Is I'm bringing that experience to us here and to you. So thank you for having me. I hope I've saved enough time for good Q&A. How many minutes do we have?
9 minutes.
Oh, good. So just a little bit less than 10. Perfect. And it was 10 minutes for Q&A. 10 or 15 is 9. It's all right, I ran over. Does anybody have any questions about humanist chaplaincy or the trip here?
As you're talking about your timeline, I'm thinking about you, if you were working in the hospital system during COVID.
I was. I transitioned from hospice work to hospital work February of 2020. I think I turned in my applications December of 2019, and I got my interview callbacks in January, followed by my hiring on I want to say February 17th, 2020. So that was a surprise. I think, I think in some ways, they were just glad to have me because people were leaving. I had a lot of senior peers who decided that it was a good time to retire because they were especially at risk. Honestly, I don't blame them. They were especially at risk, and left the field briefly. Some came back, but I think we were glad to have somebody around. So, yes, 3 years of pandemic chaplaincy, a lot of taking phone calls for families and giving families updates over the phone about how their loved one is doing because they can't come in. Either they're sick or the ward is too sick. I will always be impressed by the work of the Catholic Church, in Chicago at least, because they very quickly assembled pandemic chaplains and congregational priests, because you can't have people going into the COVID wards preaching on Sundays. So they had a special line where if you needed extreme unction, if you needed the sacrament of the sick for a COVID patient, you would call the special line, and you would get a priest who they're no longer doing mass, they're no longer doing anything like that. They 100% all the time they are in a car, driving from hospital to hospital, providing the sacrament of the sick, and performing donning and doffing of protective gear correctly so that they don't accidentally spread it. So I'll always be impressed how the Catholic diocese, or the Chicago diocese, handled that. But I worked hand in glove with those allies in the interfaith environment to minister to those patients.
So what's led you to do the leader in training with ethical culture?
congregational humanism, in 2 words, I think that as my experience in the military is that the demand for humanist and ethical culture community is incredibly high. The largest military regular religious gathering to my knowledge was Staff Sergeant Victoria Getman in Texas had on or around 1,000 people every Sunday at Lackland Air Force Base. She'd have to break it into 2 500-person rooms for her Humanist Sundays for Air Force cadets. We had an Army lawyer, and it might have been a naval lawyer, was leading a humanist meetup at Great Lakes Naval Station. It went from 2 people to 15 to 40. It's very high demand. So learning how to be a congregational leader, we're not afraid of the word congregation here, are we?
No.
Okay. I know it's on the wall outside, but yeah.
We put it there.
Right? Someone did. It doesn't mean everyone agreed to it.
Not everybody does.
Oh yeah, we have people in the former Chicago Society say, come here every Sunday, but as soon as someone lights a candle, I'm out. So yeah, learning congregational leadership is not something the Humanist Society, which focuses on professional development of celebrants and chaplains, and the AHA, the American Humanist Association, which focuses on networking and building a lot of times legal work for humanism. Neither of those groups is particularly good at congregational humanism, which the AU is pretty solid at. I think we said, 22 societies nationwide? Some of them quite large.
Have you ever come across a chaplain that professes to be Jewish or Christian or Buddhist or whatever, that you feel is able to also be humanist?
A lot of them. A lot of the best chaplains you'll meet, it's hard to tell what their religion is unless they're wearing it like on a sticker on their forehead. A good chaplain doesn't make their encounter about their religion. It makes the encounter about your religion. And they don't approach you from their faith tradition. They approach it from shared ground of mutual dignity and care. And they understand where you're coming from with your background. So I've had a lot of wonderful, my clinical pastoral education teacher was Methodist. Most of my batch was Methodist. I had 2 Korean Baptists. I've had wonderful encounters. We have the International Institute of Humanistic Judaism in Chicago, but even Christian chaplaincy, by and large in the country, is deeply rooted in rabbinical ways of conversation and encounter. In a lot of ways, the heart of chaplaincy is not something that belongs to any one religion. It's kind of like this shared ground of human dignity and worth that I feel humanism speaks directly to, but of course I would say that. I'm a humanist chaplain. But that's what they say, is that you have to be rooted in your own tradition and have a pastoral theology that comes from your tradition, why you do what you do. Other people can have why they think they do what they do, but you need to know and believe in why you do what you do. But I've encountered a lot of chaplains who work together who could easily pass for humanist chaplains, and some who were so curious about humanist chaplaincy that they asked me for, how do they become provisional chaplains in the Humanist Society, because they may be considering changing a denomination. And and I don't want to say it's a crisis, but it's not a crisis. It's not a crisis to me. I like it. The big switch that I see in young chaplains who are just going through their education is that they are not affiliated with a denomination at all. They have arrived at chaplaincy as a profession. They don't have a particular faith tradition that they feel that they have gravitated to, but they're looking for a tradition that affirms the worth and dignity of all human beings. without without theology. And I think that's humanism. You should call the Humanist Society right away. Here's their phone number. But there is a big crop of caregivers who see the world through that spiritual lens and want to address it. And they're not religious. And they've never considered chaplaincy as a result.
Have you ever spoken with someone who's dying and is, say, Christian and concerned about like their adult children or other family is atheist or agnostic? Like they're concerned they won't see those people because they're not Christian. The person dying have you ever had to advise or talk to someone like that?
The story that jumps to my mind about that is that I had a gentleman who was having some spiritual distress, and I think the nurse called me because they thought the spiritual distress was because this person had been in their hospital bed for like a day or two without eating because their surgery kept getting kicked because of people coming in who had much more urgent conditions that needed operated on, and there weren't enough operating rooms. So they just kept saying, okay, nothing to eat for the next 8 hours. Somebody came in with a heart attack. It's going to be another delay. It's going to be another delay. So they thought that was the issue. After a while, sitting and talking to him and his wife, what he was really worried about was they had just lost a family friend who was very openly atheist, and they were Christians. And he was very troubled by the prospect that this friend of his was a good man, as good a man as he had ever known. And from some of his community, he was getting that if you don't believe in God, then you go to hell. But deep in his own experience with him, he was a good man. So, I don't impose my vision of how those things work on people, but I invite people to lean into what they believe about it. So I asked him, I said, knowing what you know and believing what you believe about God, do you believe an omnipotent, benevolent deity would send an innocent good man to hell? And he said, I don't. I said, well, there's your answer. They gave me a loaf of banana bread before that Christmas. But that's an example of, what we call pastoral authority. I'm not telling him what to believe, but I'm giving him permission to believe what he believes. If you take any congregation, however big or small, and you ask everybody, I guarantee you find people in congregations that have beliefs that are utterly incompatible with the stated theology on the door. Every congregation is ultimately only a congregation of one, and it's our fortune as chaplains to get to speak to every individual person's relationship with God. Whether that is, there is no God and I don't believe in one, I don't have one, or I have an intense relationship with God and I have an intense personal relationship with God, and my church's doctrine gets in the way of me having a humane relationship with my relationship with God and my relationship with good people around me, But yeah, that was when I think of times someone's been concerned they won't see somebody in heaven, that's the story I think of.
Oh, thank you so much. That was great. I also like to thank again our interpretive signer. You're amazing.